Everyday Samurai, Episode 62. Greetings, friends, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, in service to your liberty and the security of a free state. How do you do? Thank you for joining us once again for an exploration of the principles of mindset, martial art, and political economy oriented to bringing about a free society where everyone is secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects, otherwise known as private property, so that humanity can flourish. As martial artists, you might already be familiar with the phrase, "The way is in training," written by Miyamoto Musashi in his Gorin no Sho, or the Book of Five Rings. This is a path of strategy so that we learn how to work smart rather than just hard. And it is a way also of keeping it whole, as Sun Shi or Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War. That what we're trying to do is keep things whole so that there is less destruction in the world, and that requires discipline. The greatest discipline is overcoming the human frailties, the three poisons as what's known in Buddhism: ignorance, avarice, and animosity. Another way of stating that is jealousy, envy, and general ignorance towards what makes for a truly happy life. In our own personal lives, it comes down to asking simple questions like, do I need that thing that I want? And then following up with, do I need it now? And spending enough introspection, looking within to see where that idea of desire or need or insult comes from. The Zen master Takuan Soho, who was also an advisor to Miyamoto Musashi, described in his book, The Unfettered Mind, that in order to be insulted, one must have already lost their right-mindedness. So I'm speaking as someone who needs to learn these lessons just as much as I want to teach them. When you become insulted or enraged, angry towards someone, what is it that you have lost that allowed this angle of vulnerability? This is one of those disciplines that turning away from that which makes us angry is a skill that requires maintaining a center. So we have to spend time centering ourselves in truth, not allowing ourselves to be subject to false comparisons. If that person doesn't like me, I'm going to be angry. If I don't have this, I can't be satisfied. Now, we live in a very paradoxical structure of existence where we do need things to survive, so it's okay to want. But is it a genuine want? Is it legitimate? Or is it something that we're doing to aggrandize our ego? Come back to the idea of disciplining the mind, yet also embracing discomfort, because so much of what we experience is all about discomfort, not having enough, believing that if we don't have something, we can't be complete. And so much of society is based upon illusion. So cutting through illusion is one of the greatest skills that need to be cultivated by warriors in order to protect peace. We're looking at principles that scale. They act just as much on the individual level as on the social and global level. If you look out into the world and see conflict in Ukraine or in the Middle East, it's all about control over resource. Pipeline politics, particularly in Ukraine, that have been going on ever since the fall of the Soviet Union and the expansion of NATO, but more urgently since 2014. What right do the leaders of the Western nations and NATO and the United States have over those resources in Ukraine? I recently saw Senator Lindsey Graham, an American congressperson, discussing how he doesn't want to give, quote unquote, give the mineral resources that are in Ukraine over to Russia and China. To which the immediate question should be, well, what right does that individual have to claim authority to give or not give resources outside of the United States to anyone? And the short answer is he doesn't. No one holding public office in the United States has any right to decide what happens with mineral resources in Ukraine. All of that is undelegated authority. It is arrogance. It is an arrogation of power that no public office holder should wield. And this is the process of learning and forgetting. We constitute a federated republic with this thing called the Constitution, and immediately people start to abuse its structure, far from the way that it was intended. And this is also what Friedrich Bastiat described as the great fiction, where everyone tries to live at the expense of everyone else by this thing called the state. So the lack of discipline in the mind on the individual level translates into a lack of discipline in the functions of government, which means that we, as martial artists, must always come back to the fundamental principles. What is the purpose of martial art? It's not about self-defense. It's about living with dignity, as the Igen show described. And to truly live with dignity means to maintain composure and posture in our own lives, yet also in our social life. So we go back to that idea of embracing discomfort and burning away what is no longer beneficial to our long-term goals of happiness, of well-being, of increased prosperity and social harmony. There is a way through which everyone can live well and live together, and it's known as the private property legal standard. But that also requires overcoming the natural human tendency toward ignorance, avarice, and animosity. You see this in the dojo as well. Idea of the co-instructor, somebody who has some experience, has either been at a dojo for a while or walks into a new dojo after relocating or for whatever reason, taking what they think they know into someone else's dojo. And I'm just as guilty of this as anyone else. So again, I'm teaching that which I need to learn as well. But rather than focusing on what the teacher is offering in their dojo, that person takes it upon themselves to be the co-instructor. So part of living in community means, yes, having leadership skills, but also followership skills. And that requires a disciplining of the ego, dismissing, discarding, turning away from that which does not support the highest good. And that requires thinking long-term, thinking in the abstract, thinking strategically, and having underlying principles that guide choices. So the way of strategy is also a way of discipline, and discipline means sacrifice. If you choose to uphold a principle, that means you are turning away from choosing to discard all the extraneous thing. And that's how a sharp blade gets honed and ready for action, maintained by scraping away any rust or any excess metal that does not serve its highest function of being a well-honed cutting instrument. This requires constant maintenance. And I'm speaking about the mind, the body, the spirit, as well as tools, because these types of things that no longer serve have a tendency to simply accumulate, and it requires active maintenance to weed the garden, to hone the blade, to discipline the ego. And one of the greatest disciplines that is lacking in society is a reminder, a remembrance, and an enforcement of the purpose for government. Governments are constituted to protect the life, liberty, and property of the governed. And here again, we have to embrace the paradox of being a quote-unquote government of the people, by the people, for the people, yet also allowing for the arrogation of privilege into the hands of a certain select few. Ultimately, it comes down to self-government, which in turn requires personal discipline and an ability to make a positive contribution for the well-being of others. So not only is constitutional order dependent upon a moral people, but also a resilient, strong, and martially disciplined people. Otherwise, those that would arrogate power to themselves will claim a monopoly on the use of force. And that's what it really comes down to. Who wields the use of force in society? Much more important than whatever the laws might be worded as or whatever is written down on paper. Culture is more important. And a free society requires a population that is organized, armed, and disciplined to execute the law. And that also requires a fundamental understanding of law and its purpose. And the only way that you can have a equal justice under law standard is through observation of a property integrity principle. Everyone owns themselves. Their first property is their physical body, and then whatever they can acquire without infringing upon the rights of anyone else. That means either original appropriation or trade with others. And anytime anyone tries to distract you from this property integrity standard, you can know that they are using the subtle art of deception, which is an act of war. And yes, we do want clarity. Private property legal standard provides intersubjectively ascertainable lines of authority. Who owns what? If there's a contract to exchange property, that also is an extension of the property right and provides a simple clarity by which everyone can understand who is a violator and who is the rightful owner of a thing. But politicians and bureaucrats don't want that standard. They can't abide by it because they live by expropriating others. And they get away with it because they hold all the guns. They hold all the guns because we, the people, have allowed for these permanent bureaucracies to arise. Again, it's a failure of discipline on the part of we, the people. Even when politicians and bureaucrats do the right thing, quote unquote, like just recently, the United States Supreme Court struck down the ATF rule on bump stock. And that whole thing is just absurd because the general government of the United States, which means all of its organs have no authority and are in fact prohibited from infringing upon the right of the people to keep and bear arms. So these whole arguments about what is in common use or what have you is irrelevant to the discussion, because the standard is whatever arms are suitable for we the people to execute the laws, repel invasions, or suppress insurrections is necessary to the security of a free state. It has nothing to do with common usage. It's, is there a case to be made for it being applicable in either executing the law, repelling invasions, or suppressing insurrections? If that's the case, then no politician or bureaucrat of the general government has any authority to interfere with the right to own, possess, and carry it. But that's not the world we live in. People have been hoodwinked into believing that whatever the general government says, whatever Congress writes down, whatever agencies that are created through congressional action and handed over to the executive branch to regulate is legitimate. And that is completely false. And in fact, it undermines the security of a free state. The point of fact is the general government of the United States has no authority to regulate molded plastic, which is what a bump stock is, or any other machine part. And they couch this in terms of the Interstate Commerce Clause. But if you read the Interstate Commerce Clause, it addresses trade between foreign nations, Indian tribes, and other states. Individuals and companies and their private property are not that which is of foreign nations, Indian tribes, or other states. The Interstate Commerce Clause was designed to prevent erecting barriers to free trade, not giving authority to politicians and bureaucrats to regulate private property and the free exchange thereof. But if you listen to the Supreme Court, they talk about Congress's ability to regulate bump stocks, and that is prima facie unconstitutional. So the Supreme Court is also playing into this game of allowing certain people within society to have the privilege telling other people what they can and can't own. And that is one of the reasons why we have so many problems in the world. It's only when we, the people, as collective sovereign, execute the laws, repel invasions, and suppress insurrections, that the corrupt ambitions of politicians and bureaucrats will be kept in check. And that is exactly what Dr. Edwin Vieira's book, By Tyranny Out of Necessity, The Bastardy of Martial Law, addresses. The police state is building. We can see all the earmarks rising around us. And the solution is very clear. It's constitutional, and it is necessary to the security of a free state. We, the people, must execute the law, repel invasions, and suppress insurrections without reliance upon or deference to politicians and bureaucrats. Those are the people that are most in need of being regulated. So it's time to right the ship of governance. It is time for people of good conscience to come together, discipline their own minds, which means becoming so strong in yourself, mind, body, spirit, the body of all your affairs, so that you have the extra capacity and bandwidth to make a positive contribution. So we will continue in chapter 3 of Dr. Edwin Vieira's book, where he's describing the haves, the have-nots, and the used-to-haves, and the interest group dynamics that are taking place as the police state is being built. Martial law is being imposed incrementally, little by little, like the analogy of the boiling frog. Drop a frog into a boiling pot of water, it will immediately jump out. But if you raise the temperature slowly, gradually, incrementally over time, the frog gets boiled before it even knows that it's in trouble. And this is, again, part of that discipline, the constant maintenance, refreshing in your own mind and dispelling any ignorance, avarice, or animosity so that you can discern principle, and then live that way through the discipline of daily training. Although they are knaves, the haves are not fools. They understand that inasmuch as the present regime is unsustainable politically in a system in which the consent of the governed can actually control events, the consent of the governed has to be set aside. Let the masses be unemployed or even unemployable. Let them starve, freeze, and generally be reduced to the standard of living of some benighted third world nation. Let them wax indignant about it and even engage in sporadic, isolated, uncoordinated, and aimless outbursts of civil disobedience. But under no circumstances allow that civil disobedience to evolve into widespread, organized, and systematic resistance, especially resistance based on some institutional structure which affords we the people the legal authority as well as the practical instruments for asserting their dominance over the governmental apparatus. The difficulty for the haves is how to keep the dissatisfaction of the have-nots and the used-to-haves at such a manageably low level. Two options are available. Either one, co-opt the consent of the governed by buying common Americans off, or two, eliminating the consent of the governed entirely by scaring them off. To buy off common Americans, though, promises alone will not suffice. Something tangible must actually be supplied. But under the economic circumstances that will prevail for the foreseeable future, the haves cannot offer a suffering population Franklin Roosevelt's vaunted freedom from want. For years, the haves have siphoned real capital from American markets and diverted it to foreign lands in order to take advantage of the coolie wages being paid there. Starved for real capital, this country's economy is now incapable of supplying most Americans with jobs, the incomes from which can support traditionally acceptable standards of living. Rather, austerity, that is, politically mandated mass poverty, is rapidly replacing what remains of mass prosperity in this country. Hey friends, we talk about some heavy subjects on Everyday Samurai because we have a commitment to truth, telling it like it is, and that's what being a warrior is all about. To prevail amid the harsh realities of life's challenges, you need to optimize your mind and body, so you are always able to perform when it counts. That's why I recommend the scientifically honed supplements from Neurohacker Collective. These go far beyond the average daily vitamin to give you a competitive edge in all areas of your life. I got interested in nootropic supplements because what I'd heard about their ability to provide superior mental acuity, clarity, and long-term brain health. What I found is that Neurohacker Collective has the best science-based nootropic formula available. I was so impressed with the company and team that I became an investor as well as a subscribing customer. Now I get a monthly bundle of their products that elevates cognitive function, personal energy, cellular regeneration, sleep quality, and optimizes the aging process. If you want to promote your best life with improved memory, focus, vitality, and stress resilience with the latest scientific and natural biochemistry support, check out Neurohacker Collective. You can get a 15% discount on your first order at everydaysamurai.life/neuro. That's NEURO. And use the code EDSamurai at checkout. Join me as a subscriber to one of their monthly bundle deals. That's everydaysamurai.life/neuro and use the code EDSamurai at checkout. Okay, we now return to our scheduled program in progress. In addition, the phony capital of central bank currency and credit expansion continues to pour into speculative bubbles, which all too soon could explode in hyperinflation and complete prostration of what little domestic productive enterprise that survives. So, instead of freedom from want, which they cannot deliver, the haves must offer common Americans Roosevelt's freedom from fear, which they can supply. This must be done indirectly, though, by a kind of political jujitsu. In their present state of mind, Americans cannot simply be commanded to fear their government and promised that if they do exactly what they are told, they will be freed from that fear. For a dictate of that sort would cause most of them to despise their government all the more, and move many of them more quickly than otherwise to begin forcibly resisting an oppressive inroad on their lives. Alexander Hamilton, the indefatigable panegyrist of a powerful central government, unnaturally coupled to the doyens of high finance through a national bank, paper currency, and a large public debt, has been proven woefully wrong in his airy prediction that the ever more powerful, ever more intrusive state apparatus he championed would conduce to social tranquility. And here he goes into a quote from the Federalist number 27, written by Hamilton. The more the operations of the national authority are intermingled in the ordinary exercise of government, the more the citizens are accustomed to meet with it in the common occurrences of their political life. The more it is familiarized to their sight and to their feelings, the further it enters into those objects which touch the most sensible chords, and put in motion the most active springs of the human heart. The greater will be the probability that it will conciliate the respect and attachments of the community. A government continually at a distance and out of sight can hardly be expected to interest the sensations of the people. The interference is that the authority of the Union and the affections of the citizens toward it will be strengthened rather than weakened by its extension to what are called matters of internal concern, and that it will have less occasion to recur to force, in proportion to the familiarity and comprehensiveness of its agency. The more it circulates through those channels and currents in which the passions of mankind naturally flow, the less it will require the aid of violent and perilous expedients of compulsion. Close quote. So at the present juncture in the course of human events at which the authority of the Union and the affections of the citizens toward it have been seriously weakened, the one as against the other, precisely because its extension to matters of internal concern now impinges upon just about everyone's day-to-day existence in one overly obnoxious manner or another. Americans must somehow be convinced to fear and therefore to hate something other than the governmental apparatus, which daily vexes them, and to look upon that apparatus not as the voracious and vicious predator which it is, but instead as their protector from some even more fiendish threat. To that end, rogue officials must adopt and adapt Roosevelt's dictum that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. If rogue officials can artificially generate the necessary fear itself from whatever source or of whatever nature to suit their own purposes, and if actually swayed by this synthetic fear, unthinking Americans acquiesce in those officials' assumptions or of more and more emergency powers, then, following Roosevelt's lead, officialdom can and surely will ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given if the United States were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. That is, to be invested with broad executive power to institute what amounts to martial governance. Or perhaps rogue officials will simply arrogate such power to themselves without bothering to ask Congress or anyone else, or seize that power by provoking an actual war against some foreign foe. Only after the governmental apparatus has amassed overwhelming paramilitary police state capabilities in its guise as Americans' protector will rogue officialdom cast aside its mask and emerge as their most determined, dangerous, and even deadly antagonist. The magic words in the recitative of this officially orchestrated opera buffa of mass paranoia are wage a war, because inter armis silent leges. On the excuse of war, almost any legal, political, or even moral scruples can be disregarded, almost all usurpation tolerated, and almost any enormity rationalized. Even the arch-centralizer Alexander Hamilton warned of this outcome. Quote, "There is a wide difference between military establishments in a country seldom exposed by its situation to internal invasion, and in one in which is often subject to them and always apprehensive of them. The rulers of the former can have no good pretext, if they are even so inclined, to keep on-foot armies so numerous as must be maintained in the latter. These armies being in the first case rarely, if at all, called into activity for interior defense, the people are in no danger of being broken to military subordination. The laws are not accustomed to relaxation in favor of military exigencies. The civil state remains in full vigor, neither corrupted nor confounded with the principles or propensities of the other state. The smallness of the army renders the natural strength of the community an overmatch for it, and the citizens not habituated to look upon the military power for protection, or to submit to its oppressions, neither love nor fear the soldiery. They view them with a spirit of jealous acquiescence in a necessary evil, and stand ready to resist a power which they suppose may be exerted to the prejudice of their rights. The army under such circumstances may usefully aid the magistrate to suppress a small faction, or an occasional mob, or insurrection, but it will be unable to enforce encroachments against the united efforts of the great body of the people. In a country in the predicament last described, the contrary of all this happened. The perpetual menacings of danger oblige the government to be always prepared to repel it. Its armies must be numerous enough for instant defense. The continual necessity for their services enhances the importance of the soldier, and proportionability degrades the condition of the citizen. The military state becomes elevated above the civil. The inhabitants of territories, often the theater of war, are unavoidably subjected to frequent infringements on their rights, which serve to weaken their sense of those rights, and by degrees the people are brought to consider the soldiery not only as their protectors, but as their superiors. The transition from this disposition to that of considering them masters is neither remote nor difficult. But it is very difficult to prevail upon a people under such impressions to make a bold or effectual resistance to usurpations supported by the military power. And that comes from Federalist number 8. So we see here also that even Hamilton recognized that people subjected to constant usurpations will start to bow down to a military power. And it seems as though in 2024, all the world, and especially in the United States, is enamored by the military, instead of recognizing that a standing army is inimical to the liberties of a free society. That we, the people, everyone, must have a baseline understanding of martial integrity, have some baseline of capability so that these institutions do not become superior to the civil. And that's exactly what the Constitution calls for. We, the people, execute the law, repel invasions and suppress insurrections without reliance upon politicians or bureaucrats or bureaucratic agencies. And again, remember that bureaucracies are merely bastions of socialism. They cannot rationally calculate the use of resources. They will always squander whatever resources they have. And another point here, where in Federalist number 8, Hamilton describes the frontier locations. I was a border patrol agent. Within 75 miles of the border, federal agents have special powers. They set up internal checkpoints, conduct inspections without warrant, things along those lines. All the things that Hamilton described are coming to pass. But the one thing that he was wrong about was the ability of people to resist this propensity for elevating the military and the political caste above themselves and to allow for these special privileges. But there is a solution. Continuing. The war on terrorism, being waged apparently forever on battlefields both foreign and domestic, provides the perfect example of an artificial war against a fictitious fear. As former President George W. Bush declared, freedom and fear are at war in this country. The ultimate purpose of the war on terrorism, though, is not to wage a war against fear generated by foreigners, but instead to deploy fear of foreigners as a weapon of war against Americans. Rogue officials stir up the fear of terrorism with terrorism as their excuse. They arrogate new war powers to themselves. With these war powers, they then actually terrorize their own citizenry on the pretense of fighting terrorism. They go so far as to invent the new category of so-called domestic terrorists or homegrown terrorists in order to induce some Americans to fear others and to clamor for the Homeland Security apparatus to clamp down on them. Thus, the fear of terrorism never abates and can never wane because it is the product of rogue officialdom's rule, namely a mode of government by intimidation of its own citizens. So, not surprisingly, in the topsy-turvy world of contemporary political propaganda, the groups which rogue officials most vociferously culminate as domestic terrorists or homegrown terrorists consist of constitutionalists and other patriots who are trying to warn their countrymen of precisely the dangers those very officials pose. These Americans are defamed as terrorists by actual terrorists because they speak out against those terrorists. Meanwhile, official terrorism continues to increase and intensify, aiming inexorably at full-blown tyranny. Once it reaches that point, common Americans will really have something monstrous to fear, namely the domestic police state apparatus lowering over them. But then they will be unable to wage their own war on terrorism, that is, a war of self-defense, against it. Self-evidently, this process has nothing to do with any rational conception of the consent of the governed. Common Americans were never asked whether they needed or wanted to prosecute an interminable and unwinnable war on terrorism at home as well as overseas, and at any cost, let alone the cost of the permanent loss of their own liberties. Rogue officials simply announced the war on terrorism, and on the basis of the typical tyrant's threat that either you are with us or you are with the terrorists, demanded that common Americans acquiesce in it. Professional panic mongers then put forward hysterical demands a la Roosevelt for broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given if the United States were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. And common Americans never asked whether they approved of any such broad executive power either. But how could they have been asked? Or if they had been asked, how could they have assented? Inasmuch as essentially all of the novel powers cobbled together on account of the war on terrorism are patently unjust powers, which no people may rightfully delegate to any government, even with the consent of the governed. So that gives us something to think about. I will stop on page 58 of chapter 3. We still have one more section to go within this chapter, and I hope you come back. Be sure to follow on Twitter Check out shop.everydaysamurai.life if you're looking for more content like this. We have books, namely Money, Militia, and the Market, 3 elements necessary to secure liberty, as well as The End of Gun Control, which is a philosophical discussion of how to put an end to gun control, namely by maintaining a free state. We the people execute the laws, and remember that no politician or bureaucrat has any legitimate business disarming the people or interfering with the right to keep and bear arms, because the right to keep and bear arms is necessary to the security of a free state. A free market in arms, whatever arms are conceivably suitable for we the people to execute the laws, repel invasions, or suppress insurrections, is necessary. In fact, that free market is a necessary precondition. And that book is all designed on changing the nature of the debate regarding quote-unquote gun control. So we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Everyday Samurai and look forward to seeing you next time. If you like what you've heard here, be sure to like, subscribe, and share the show with someone you think would resonate with our message of advancing liberty through mindset, martial art, and political economy. Help to build that community of enlightened warriors that are in service to liberty. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.